The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Private Mara Kessler was dragged into the courtyard of Camp Ardennes, her wrists bound loosely with a rope that was more symbol than restraint. She did not struggle. She had learned, over the last 6 weeks, that struggling only fed the men who wanted an excuse. Sergeant Holt stood before her with a pair of clippers in his hand, the metal cold and gleaming even under the gray sky. And behind him, the entire platoon had gathered in a loose, uneasy circle, the way people gather around a fire they are afraid to look at directly. Mara had arrived at the camp with nothing but a duffel bag and a quiet, unreadable calm that unsettled the other recruits from the first day. She followed every order without complaint, ran every mile without falling behind, and never once raised her voice, even when Holt singled her out for punishment, convinced her silence was arrogance rather than restraint. When she was accused of insubordination for a report she had never filed, no one asked for evidence. When she was blamed for a supply shortage that predated her arrival, no one checked the records. The platoon had decided, without much thought, that she was someone safe to blame, and Holt had decided that today would be the day he broke her completely. "You think you're better than this uniform," Holt said, more to the crowd than to her, and began running the clippers over her scalp. Dark hair fell in clumps to the wet gravel, and a few younger recruits looked away, ashamed in a way they could not yet name. Mara did not close her eyes. She watched Holt's face the entire time, and there was something in her gaze that was not defiance and not fear, but a patient sorrow, as though she pitied him more than she resented him. It was in that exact moment, with half her head shorn bare, that a black vehicle rolled through the camp gates and stopped hard in the mud. The door opened before the engine had fully died, and General Adrienne Voss stepped out, her coat snapping in the wind, her face already twisted into something between fury and disbelief. She crossed the courtyard in long strides, and the entire platoon scrambled to attention, boots clapping against gravel except for Holt, who was still holding the clippers, frozen. "Uncomprehending. Get your hands off her," Voss said. "Low and dangerous." Holt straightened, confused. "General, this recruit was insubordinate. She is your superior," Voss said, and the words landed in the courtyard like a dropped shell. "Colonel Kessler has been embedded in this unit for 6 weeks on my direct orders, evaluating command conduct from the inside. Every report of cruelty, every act of favoritism, every excuse you have made for breaking down the weakest among you instead of building up the strongest, she has documented all of it. And you just shaved her head in front of 40 witnesses. The silence that followed was total. Somewhere in the crowd, a young private named Owens realized he was shaking. Holt's mouth opened and closed without sound, the clippers slipping from his fingers into the mud. Mara, Colonel Kessler, did not gloat. She did not even raise her chin in triumph. Instead, she knelt down slowly and picked the clippers up out of the mud herself, turning them over once in her hands before setting them gently on a nearby crate. "I asked to be treated like anyone else," she said quietly, loud enough for the whole courtyard to hear. "I did not ask to be treated like nothing. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that matters in an army worth serving in." She turned slowly around to Holt, whose face had gone the color of old paper. "You're not being relieved because you enforced discipline," she said. "You're being relieved because you built your discipline on humiliation instead of respect, and you taught 40 young soldiers that cruelty is what leadership looks like. I want them to learn something else before they forget this day." In the weeks that followed, the story spread through every barracks in the region, not as scandal, but as something closer to a parable. Recruits who had once flinched at Holt's voice found themselves, instead, seeking out Colonel Kessler for guidance, drawn not to her rank, but to the calm, unshaken decency she had carried through 6 weeks of undeserved punishment without once losing herself to bitterness. She kept her hair short long after it grew back, not as a reminder of what had been done to her, but as a quiet symbol of what she had chosen not to become. Years later, when young officers asked why she never sought revenge against the men who humiliated her, she would only say that revenge was easy and cheap, and never once built anything worth keeping. Kindness, she told them, was the only rank that couldn't be stripped away by any uniform, order, or storm, and it was the only one she had ever truly fought to earn. Long after her own service ended, people who had never met her still repeated her words to strangers, passing them quietly from one uncertain heart to another, the way a single candle can light 100 more without losing any of its own flame.